All right, this is a simple series. I haven't done one of these in a while, where we're just going to read the text, consider some analysis, conclude with an application. It is not something that we can do in Luke because the chapters are so long in Luke. Like half the chapters in Luke are 50 verses or longer, which makes it really hard to do like a cohesive 25-minute lesson. The fact that we're doing Sunday night, which means I have much more time, combined with the shorter, sort of more simplistic version of the narrative in Ruth, means that we can just read all of it. We're going to read all of it over the course of these sermons. We're going to read all of it in the sermon itself, talk about what the story is, what's going on in the story, some background stuff, and then conclude with some application for us. It's a really back to basics sort of a sermon series, which is nice to do every so often, especially contrasted with Ecclesiastes that we're doing on Sunday morning, which is about as far from basic as it gets in a Bible study. So let's just read beginning in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. We already talked about the background. Last week we talked about sort of the setting or the context of Ruth. I would encourage you, if you haven't listened to that, to go back. Talking about the time of the judges and sort of some overall themes in the book of Ruth and in the time of the judges. So, in the days of the judges, when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of that man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died. So the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. This is the basic opening of the story, setting the stage of what's going to happen. Pretty basic for 5 verses. A couple of interesting textual notes about this. One, Bethlehem literally means place of bread or place of food. So there's an irony to be driven from the place of bread by a famine. Now, one of the things that is sort of an undercurrent in this story, and we'll introduce it now, we'll talk about it several times as we go through chapter 1, really as we go through the whole book of Ruth. Knowing what we know now, looking at the story in our context, we know the whole story, of course, leading up to David, and then we're going to, of course, eventually get us to Christ when we talk about the genealogy of Matthew. It's hard to know, and this will be relevant particularly when we get to Naomi's attitude in chapter 1. It's hard to know exactly how much of this is being intentionally driven by God and how much of this is sort of God coincidentally using things that happen to further his will. Because the phrase Ephrathah or Ephrath in Bethlehem is used in a couple of places in Scripture. Genesis 35:19, Rachel died and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And Jacob set a pillar over her tomb. It's the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day. And then all the way in Micah, from the very beginning of Israel to the end of the Israelite story in Micah, but you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel. And again, reading this post-David, we can see the connective tissue. The story is part of this chain that will eventually lead us to the ruler in Israel, that is Jesus, right? Lead us to Christ. And so this famine that appears in the land, which we don't really know much about, we do know that famine was one of the things that God said would happen to the Israelites if they were unfaithful, if they did not obey him. He would make their crops fail. And they would have a harder time in growing crops in agriculture. Weather would be bad. That was part of the consequence if they were not faithful to the covenant. And of course, we know in the time of the judges, they're really not faithful most of the time, not faithful to the covenant. Everybody's doing what was right in his own eyes. So this famine, we don't know. We could sort of make some guesses here. That we know that David is going to come from Ruth, this line. She's going to be a part of this chain that leads to David and then eventually leads to Jesus. Was the famine something that God did in part to get Elimelech over there to bring Ruth back? I don't know. We have to be careful about speculating here. But it is not outside of God's own stated purpose that a famine would be a consequence for their rebellion and their selfishness in the time of the judges. We keep reading in 4b, we'll pick up back in verse 4. They lived there about 10 years. Both Mahlon and Chilion died. So the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. That's Naomi, right? She arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. I've italicized the word return, which appears 12 times in Ruth chapter 1. That's not clear in English because several times it's translated turn back or go back, right? So we can't, the way the English works, the way the grammar of English works, we wouldn't really get that. This is the word that appears most often in the first chapter. This crossroads language, these 3 women, which direction will they choose? Where will they go, and for what reasons? Naomi is returning to Israel because she's heard about the famine relief. They've been visited, or the Lord has visited Israel. And then as they go down the journey, she's urging Ruth and Orpah to return. Go back to Moab. Go back to your hometown and homeland, and we'll talk about the reasons why that is. But the return is motivated in each case by the hope of something better in the return. The hope of something better if you go back, whatever it is. In the case of in the case of Naomi, the better thing that is hoped for in the return is food. We're going to go back. God has visited his people. I can go back home, and hopefully in Israel I can find what it is that I need. Because in Moab she doesn't have what she needs. She doesn't have a husband or sons to care for her. At least in Israel, she is known there. She grew up there. She knows the customs. She's familiar with the people. And at least nominally, although it's debatable whether Israel did this, there were provisions for care for her exact circumstance, to care for the widows in Israel. So in her mind, returning is the avenue of hope. And as we keep going, that's going to be the avenue of hope that Naomi puts forth for Orpah and Ruth, to return in an avenue of hope. It's unclear what the 10 years refer to. Was this the total time that Naomi was in Moab? Was it the length of the marriage of her sons, Mahlon and Chilion, before the sons died? It's unclear what the 10 years is. It does color the story a little bit, whether it's the length of the total time or the length of their marriages, because it significantly increases the age of Ruth and Orpah if they were married for 10 years, versus if Naomi was in Moab for 10 years, which is relevant because Naomi wants them to get remarried. Naomi is anticipating that Orpah and Ruth will be remarryable, which indicates that they're not very old yet, unlike Naomi herself. Now, Naomi hears the famine has subsided, and she or whoever, it's unclear at this point, ascribes that to the Lord. One of the things that is clear in Ruth and in Israelite literature more general is that Naomi ascribes both hardship and blessing to the direct action of God. In the Israelite mind, God was the cause of all. He was in control of all things. If there's a famine in the land, that's God. But if there's famine relief, that's also God. God is the one who is in control of all things. And so Naomi, in the pattern that is very typical in Israelite literature, again, we're thinking probably most famously of Job, who automatically ascribes his suffering to God. It's God's done this to me. Naomi has a similar attitude, but she's also cognizant that the Lord was the cause of blessing as well, the cause of the blessing of the alleviation of the famine. The next section is a threefold escalation. As they start on their journey back, you kind of get the sense that wherever they are in Moab, the 3 of them start their journey toward Bethlehem. And Naomi at some point urges them to turn around, stay in Moab, stop coming with me. It's unclear. Maybe she thought they were just going to escort her to the border of Moab, and then they cross the border and it becomes clear, oh, Ruth and Orpah are intending to come with me. And so Naomi begins to plead with them, again, to return. This idea of turn back or return, it's the same word in the original story, to go back, Ruth 1, 8 through 10. Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, go and return, each of you to her mother's house. They had left to be part of Naomi's house with Mahlon and Chilion. Now she's urging them, return, go back, don't be with me anymore, go back to your mothers. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. And I think it's fairly clear, Naomi is intending for them to be remarried, to get married again. She kissed them and they lifted up their voices and wept, and they said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. May the Lord deal kindly with you throughout Old Testament literature is in many places a way of releasing them from obligation. This is a phrase that in a lot of times in the Old Testament is a signal of the end of a relationship. They're not going to have dealings anymore with each other. Naomi is severing their tie to her. You don't have to care for me anymore. You don't have to deal with me anymore. The Lord bless you and go with you, and you can go back and you don't have to deal with me anymore. Only God can help them now. Naomi has nothing for them. Naomi has nothing to offer them. And so Naomi makes this plea, the Lord deal kindly with you as you leave. We're done. And very clearly, she expects them to remarry and find security in their society. One of the things that's very clear in this story is the role of marriage as a means of security for women in both Israel and Moab. And this is a thing that is well known in ancient societies. For the most part, women were not only expected to marry, but that's where they found security. And which is why one of the things that is most unusual about Israelite law, the law of Moses, versus the laws of the nations around them, is that God was very specific about making provision specifically for widows. Those who did not have the security anymore, God made sure in the law of Moses to provide provision for them, where most of the countries around them, they didn't do that as far as we can tell. It just sort of was, you either got remarried or you didn't have any security. Ruth 1:11, Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters. It is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." And they lifted up their voices and wept again. This threefold progression is marked by the weeping. This is a very emotional conversation for Naomi and her daughters-in-law as they are some point on the journey between, well, Moab's over here from your perspective. From Moab to Bethlehem down here, there's some stage of the journey, and Ruth and Orpah seemingly were intending to go with her the whole way, and Naomi is trying to get them to leave. Go back. She didn't, I don't think, expected to need to persuade them. I think she perhaps thought they would want to leave, which is why she says the first thing, that, you can go, it's okay. But now she has to persuade them. They won't leave. They both say, we'll go with you. And so she has nothing to offer. The security of marriage, remarriage, won't be found with her. And there is some allusion here, perhaps. I would encourage you, we're not going to read it tonight. We're going to read Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10 in a later lesson, I think chapter 3. There's some allusion to what's called the Levirate marriage in Deuteronomy 25, which will appear later in the story with Boaz. And it's perhaps that's what Naomi is referring to here, where if someone died without a male heir, the brothers of the dead husband were supposed to provide the heir for the woman, to, again, as a means of security, the security for the widow. It is unclear if that's what intended, because, of course, Ruth and Orpah, as Moabites, have their own customs and traditions. They didn't grow up in Israel. They don't have the Levirate marriage in Moab, as far as we can tell from what we know about the Moabite traditions. They have their own customs and traditions. They would be doing their own thing. And Ruth is encouraging them, go back to your mother's house and do whatever it is that you guys do. Do what the Moabites do in your finding of a spouse. And again, we don't know enough about the practical implications, or implementation rather, of the Levirate law in Israelite society. Well, again, we'll talk about this in chapter 3. What happens later with Boaz departs from Deuteronomy 25 in some key ways. And so we'll talk about that more as we get there. I'm not sure if the Levirate marriage is necessarily what's being referred to by Naomi here when she talks about, am I going to have more sons for you to marry? Well, she might be referring to this law in Deuteronomy 25. More significantly, Naomi explicitly ascribes her suffering to Yahweh, right? Know, my daughters, it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. She is very directly ascribing her suffering to God. He has put his hand against me. My husband is dead. My sons are dead. I have nothing for you. And that is the persuasion that she's trying to use to get them to go back. Unlike Job, who also experienced great loss and suffering, Naomi seems to have given up. She's not questioning God as far as we can tell. She's just like, he did this and now I have no hope. I'm just hopeless. There's no hope for me. She doesn't act like there's anything to be done or any relief to be had. I'm just going to go back home. You guys don't need to follow me. I have nothing to offer you. And really, she's become truly bitter. We'll talk about the word bitter in just a minute. But the bitterness that has come from her suffering, even though she acknowledges that God has blessed Israel, again, the Lord has visited his people to relieve them from the famine. And in the time of Judges, again, the backdrop of the Judges, it would have been well familiar to the people by this point, the cycle of rebellion and salvation and rebellion and salvation. Like this has happened, depending on where you place the story in the Judges, this has probably happened 4 or 5 or 6 times. We're in the 7th judge, perhaps. So Israel knows. We rebel against God, we cry out to him, he saves us. Right? So she understands that on a national level, yet for her own personal life, she seems to have given up. God has done that. He has set his hand against me, and it's bitter for me for your sake. That is, if you stick with me, your lives are not going to get any better. I don't want the burden. It almost seems to be that Naomi doesn't want the burden of dragging them down with her. She has such a bitterness in her heart about what she thinks God has done to her that she just, go away from me. My life is useless and worthless. Go away and save yourselves. Don't be with me anymore. So there's another round of weeping. Again, very emotional story. They've been together some number of years. It could be up to as many as 10 years, again, depending on how you gauge the 10 years. Orpah leaves. She returns. She goes back to Moab. Ruth, of course, does not. Ruth 1:15. She said, Naomi that is, see your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also. What's she saying? The way the Lord's treated you, may the Lord treat me that way, if anything but death parts me from you. When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Naomi doesn't really commend Ruth for this. She doesn't say, I'm so glad, thank you so much for saying that. She's just like, fine, come with me. I can't change your mind. Guess you might as well come with me. This seems to be the case as we go through the story. These might be the most famous verses in the book of Ruth. I think rightfully so. In Israelite tradition, that is sort of extra-biblical Israelite literature, Ruth is one of the books that is read in the feast days. This is a foundational text of proselytizing or conversion. Rightfully so, if you go back to the language here. This is a verse that is venerated in Israelite tradition as this is what it looks like when a non-Israelite wants to become an Israelite. This is sort of the pattern that is used in extra-biblical tradition to sort of teach that idea. Ruth is declaring a total life realignment in accordance with Naomi's homeland and tradition. And there's an escalation here. The escalation is, I'm going to leave and live where you live. I'm leaving my homeland and making a new home. I'm going to leave the religion, my God, not my God anymore. Now I'm going to worship your God. And then there's the last thing, to be buried in Israel instead of Moab. Where you are buried, there I'll be buried. Being buried in a person's homeland was an important thing to many ancient peoples. And again, I think Joseph, the story of Joseph is the most poignant example. There's an example in the story of Abraham. In the patriarchs specifically, there's a bunch of these stories where they were very concerned about being buried in the homeland. And Ruth says to Naomi, I'm going to go with you to the extent, I'm going to convert so much that that's where I want to be buried. Don't take me back to Moab. I'm going to be buried where you are. That's a total conversion of the way that she's thinking about life. But again, Naomi truly does not seem to want Ruth to come along. And it's hard to know, again, why Naomi has this attitude. When she saw that she could not persuade her, she stopped talking. And I don't know if they probably didn't pass the journey just in silence, but Naomi just gives up arguing. And I wonder if this is altruistic on Naomi's part, That is, it would really be better for you if you went back to Moab? Or is it selfish? She doesn't want the reminder or the burden that Ruth's presence would bring. Sometimes people are like that, aren't they? They have tragedy in their lives, and they just want to remove every possible reminder of that tragedy. And I do wonder if that's what Naomi is thinking here. She's so bitter in her heart. She's so despairing in her heart. Just leave me alone. And Ruth, of course, says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep coming with you. Now, we should be careful in our interpretation of Ruth's action here. That is, the text doesn't give us much insight into her motivation. We don't know the extent to which she has already been taught anything about Yahweh. Does she know about the God of Israel? How much does she know? We don't really know the situation that she would have had in Moab. The text does not tell us. Like, would she have had an easy time marrying again? This is where the idea of 10 years comes into play. If she's been married to I can't remember which spouse she was married to. If she had been married to that son for 10 years, she presumably hasn't had a child in that amount of time, which is a strong indication of barrenness, which would have really severely limited her ability to get married again. Now, if she hasn't been married for 10 years, that may not be the case, but there are some indications in the text, perhaps, that Ruth thinks her life will be better if she returns to Israel with Naomi. That her life will be, she has better prospects with Naomi than she would back in Moab with Ruth. It's hard to say. Again, we just have to be careful about ascribing motivation here as we think about what the text says versus what the text doesn't say. We keep reading in verse 19. The two of them went on till they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. Not only because they're two people walking into town, but very clear, specifically two women without any men, just waltzing into town. Would have been very unusual at the time. The whole town was stirred up because of them, and the women said, "Is this Naomi?" Again, she's been gone, let's say 10 years, possibly more, if that 10 years refers to the marriages. They kind of recognize her, but she's been gone a long time. "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Don't call me Naomi." Yeah, I am Naomi, but don't call me that anymore. "Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." The word Mara means bitter. The word Naomi means pleasant or delightful. And Naomi feels about as far from pleasant or delightful as she possibly can. She feels in her soul bitter. And so she wants to be called bitter. Don't call me pleasant. Call me bitter. Because the Lord has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. And there's an interesting irony, an inversion in Naomi's life. She left with an empty belly. They left because of famine, right? They left because they had no food. They were empty. But, of course, what has happened to her in Moab has changed her perspective. She doesn't really care so much about the food as much anymore because I left with a full family. I left with a husband and 2 sons. And now I have come back empty. There's food here, but does that matter? Because my husband and my sons are dead. The Lord has dealt very bitterly with me. Call me bitter from now on. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? Her use of the word Almighty, El Shaddai would be God Almighty. It's really just Shaddai. But the word Almighty is instructive of her mindset here. And again, there's a little bit of a, irony. I don't know. I never know when I'm supposed to use the word ironic in text. There's an interesting interplay of words on the word Almighty because she's acknowledging that God has the power to do anything. In that title, Almighty, he can do anything. He has control of all things. And remember, she's already ascribed the famine relief to Yahweh. He visited the people and relieved them of the famine. He's given them food. Thus, in the vein of Job and his 3 friends, she ascribes almightiness to Yahweh. She ascribes control of all things to him. Why wouldn't she also ascribe her suffering to Yahweh? He is almighty. He could have prevented my husband and my 2 sons from dying. He could have blessed me in that way. He has control of all things. So yeah, he must have done this to me. That's what she says at the end, isn't it? Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? In Naomi's mind, and one of the things that makes her so bitter, I think, is that she is very confident that God has done this to her. And this is the problem of suffering encapsulated. This is essentially the problem of evil in a very sort of poignant story of it, where Naomi believes in God's power, Naomi believes in God's control, and thus is led to the conclusion, if God is almighty and my son and my sons and husband have died, it must be because God doesn't like me. God has set his hand against me for some reason. Now, Naomi is not led into apostasy, which is commendable. She is led into bitterness and despair, which, while not commendable, is understandable. Her bitterness and despair because of her belief in Yahweh's refusal to help her. And so this is, again, why she changes her name. Her pleasantness or pleasure or delight is about as far from her current mental state as possible. And of course, the question, as we think about application, haven't we all experienced or know someone who has experienced this kind of bitterness? A bitterness that ultimately stems from a belief in God accompanied with the experience of suffering. If we didn't believe in God, in some ways the suffering would be easier to swallow. If I just thought the world was uncaring and random and it just, there's no God and it just sort of stuff happens, I think I could swallow the things that happen a lot easier because nobody cares. Nobody's watching out. It's just sort of random chance and it happened and it is what it is. But it's the suffering combined with a belief in a sovereign, loving God that creates the tension, creates the difficulty. In many ways, this is Naomi's story. The book is called the Book of Ruth. But in a lot of ways, the story is about bringing Naomi out of her bitterness and helping Naomi see what God is doing in her life to provide for her, even though she can't see it at the moment. She can't see what God has been doing. So, Ruth 1:22, Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, came with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of the barley harvest. The end of chapter 1 really enforces Ruth's foreignness. Ruth the Moabite. She is non-Jew. She has come to Israel. Her conversion doesn't, and I'm using the word conversion lightly. Again, we don't know exactly the mental state that Ruth is in at the time as she regards Yahweh. Her conversion doesn't necessarily remove the separation that might arise from her presence in Bethlehem because Israel is a very separatist nation, right? There's a very separatist mindset. And of course, I think a lot of small towns also have this idea of sort of viewing suspicions with outsider. And so this might be something that comes up as we go through the story of Naomi and Ruth, who's this foreign woman. As we sort of wrap up chapter 1, look at high-level view, I want to reiterate that the story is in large part about Naomi's grief and God's providence in that grief. The story of Naomi going from Naomi to Mara and then back to Naomi. There's a change in Naomi's mindset as we go through the story. You might have experienced this kind of bitterness. I don't know. I know that everybody in this room has experienced loss. Maybe, I don't know. It's hard to talk about levels of loss. You think about what happened to Job. You think about what happened to Naomi. Whatever it is that you've experienced in your life, the loss that you've experienced might cause this kind of bitterness in your heart. That is a very real possibility, even for Christians. Again, Naomi believes in God. Naomi believes in Yahweh. She believes in his power and his control. And in some ways, that belief is contributing to her bitterness. And I don't know, maybe that's something that you struggle with. Because you believe in a loving God. You believe in the Almighty, who looks down at you and it seems does not answer your prayers, and has not provided for you, and has not been kind to you. Maybe you would like to be called Mara. As we read the story of Ruth, one of the things I think really we need to have in our minds is that Naomi might be right. Naomi might be right. It is very possible that Yahweh has contributed to this. Because, of course, we know where Ruth is going to be in the story of Jesus. Ruth is going to be in the line, bringing us to the Savior. And there's a lot of things that happen in the Old Testament that God clearly is directing to bring about from the beginning of the world, from the foundation of the world. Jesus is coming. We know that he's coming. That is a thing that has to happen. And Ruth is part of that. I don't know, think about God's omniscience. It's hard to fathom how much he knows and how much all of the moving parts of history that he has in his mind all at once. I say it's hard to fathom. It's impossible to fathom. I can't get it. All the things that he has in his mind at once, as he's orchestrating the arrival of first David, the son, the king of Israel, who's going to be so pivotal to Israelite history, and then eventually Jesus. How much of this is God doing? I don't know. And again, we got to be careful about speculating. How much of this is God directing the story of Jesus to come about? But, of course, as God is directing the story of Jesus throughout Israelite history, he's also going to provide for Naomi. He is going to work in tragedy to bless her specifically. Not just bless everybody through Jesus, but to provide specifically for Naomi in the course of this story to bring her out of her bitterness and back into a state where she can delight in Yahweh. Where Naomi is unusual and commendable is her continued loyalty to Yahweh, even if she feels abandoned to him. One of the things that is interesting is she never has any expression of doubt about his existence. She never has any expression of doubt about his ability to help Israel as a whole. This is just her own personal feelings, her own personal life. And again, maybe that's you. You feel like God has turned his hand against you. And you might even do that while acknowledging he's still working in the church. He's still working in the world. He's still working in his broad, big plans. You just wonder what's your place in it? Why am I dealing with the things that I'm dealing with? Perhaps where we can learn most is Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. Our presence in the lives of the suffering, our willingness to stand by them, is often the difference between apostasy and faithfulness. That is to say, Ruth's willingness to stand by Naomi is the mechanism by which God is going to bless Naomi again. And in your life, the people that you know, God can use you to be that mechanism of blessing in their suffering. I don't know how that's going to happen. None of us do, because we're not God, and we don't have omniscience. And I wish we did, but we don't. But we have to stay in their lives to be that mechanism, don't we? We have to stay with people, be by them, be with them in their suffering if we want God to use us to bless them. And I think sometimes we are uncomfortable with suffering. We're uncomfortable or we feel awkward about it. People sitting in their grief and being with them. And my encouragement to you is to stay with them so that God can use you to bless them. So that God can use you to bring them back out of their bitterness and back into a state of Naomi, that is pleasantness or delight in God. But if we leave, if we go away, even if they might be urging us to, Naomi was really urging Ruth and Orpah to go away. Even if people are urging us to go away, just to stay in contact, in fellowship, in communion, so that God can use us. Regardless of her motivations, Ruth's actions are a model of conversion to people today. We'll end with this point. The Israelites use this story throughout their traditions as sort of the pillar of what conversion looks like. Wait, how do you say that verb? Proselytization? That can't be right. Proselytizing? I don't know. Whatever that technical term is. Conversion. We'll just say conversion. The Israelites use this story as a model of conversion. That is, what does it look like to convert, to turn? This idea of turning back, right, to return. Very similar to the New Testament word repent, to change direction, to turn around. And when we think about our own conversion, we think about what that looks like today as we offer the invitation. What is God looking for people to return out of the world and come back to him? He's looking for someone to leave location. You're not going to necessarily move your house, but you're switching your identity as a citizen of the world versus a citizen of God, Isn't that what Ruth does? Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. It's a change of citizenship. I'm going to go live with you. And that's what God's looking for in conversion today, to change the way we think about ourselves. Now I belong in his kingdom. I belong with his people. It's also a conversion, of course, ultimately of loyalty to God. We put away whatever gods we had before. Most of us in our society, not polytheistic, not worshiping Zeus or Hermes or Baal or whoever, Molech or Chemosh in the ancient times, but you have maybe the god of family, maybe the god of money, maybe the god of self. Conversion requires a change of allegiance, of loyalty to the one God, to the only God who will have your loyalty for the rest of your life. And ultimately, we don't really think about the burial as much. But the burial language, as we conclude and offer the invitation, where you are buried, I will be buried, is we're looking toward a future home, the end of our lives, right? We're looking toward the end beyond when we die, toward that new home in heaven. I want to go there, don't you? I want to be there. I don't want to go there. I want to be there now. I want to be there so bad. To have the removal of suffering that Revelation 21 and 22 talk about, to have that alleviation. I don't know when that will happen, but as we journey together until we get there, take the lesson of Ruth and stick by people who are suffering. Stick by people who are hurting so that God can use you to be a blessing in their lives. We're going to sing Redeemed. Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, who has brought us out of our state of lostness, our state of decay, into the kingdom of his marvelous light. If you're ready, come while we stand and sing.